Hello, welcome to another episode of The High Ground, powered by Premier Companies. Jeff, how are you doing this 2026 new year?
I'm wonderful, Sal.
First podcast of the new year?
It is. We got to shake off the, the kind of the vacation.
Yeah, a little rusty.
Christmas vacation, New Year vacation, cobwebs, get back at it.
We got the right guest in here to help us.
Who we got?
Glenn Longabaugh is back with us today.
Oh, crowd favorite.
Yep. He's got his own groupies that follow him on the podcast. So
that's really sad.
Premier Agronomist. But we got to start off with the question of the day. This is an easy one.
It is.
What is your favorite dog breed and least favorite?
Yeah, well,
and why?
You know what? We've always had black labs. I don't care what color they are, but any kind of retriever is kind of my favorite dog. I like hounds too, but they're, they're not very smart. They're hard to train, and I mean, they're beautiful, right? I love beagles, bloodhounds, bassets.
Anyhow,
but yeah, retrievers are really my favorite. And my least favorite is, without question, anything that's aggressive. I just don't have a use for mean dogs, right? Yeah. Whether it's a Chihuahua or a pit bull.
Yeah.
I don't care if they.
Just a matter of time.
Yeah. If they bite kids, or bite you on the ankle, they bite anything, right?
Yep.
Yep. Jeff?
I got to think about this. So I grew up with Australian Shepherds. That was what I've had majority of my life. But I've had retrievers and I've had English pointers and all that stuff and all great dogs and stuff. But we had a standard size Schnauzer that my wife just out of the blue decided one day that she wanted. I found her one. We just lost that dog last year. Had her about 14 years. That is a cool little breed. Great dog. They're the standard size. They're not the little yappers, because that little
sounds like a medium-sized dog.
Yeah, medium size, but smaller to medium, but very cool dog. And my least favorite would be any of the little ankle biting yappers.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, mine would be, I'm same way. Labs are about, those are just consistent. Golden retrievers are almost too nice. Those are almost irritatingly nice.
Somebody breaks into your house, you have a golden retriever. The golden retriever will help them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So we got a silver lab. I've always had black or chocolate or yellow, but we got a silver lab. And the difference between a silver lab and a black or a chocolate
is the color, isn't it?
Well, that and 3 times as much money.
Oh, okay.
So, and so we got a silver lab. I don't know why, but she wanted a silver lab. Good dog, but he is getting ornery in his old age. He will really bark. I think the FedEx man, FedEx has always got kind of different drivers. It's not UPS, the same guy all the time, but the FedEx guy must have done something, because if it's a white truck, I mean, he comes unglued. So
that's another high ground episode right there.
That's a whole nother one.
Yeah. A whole nother one right there.
And I'm with you on the ankle biters. I tell you, those little yappy.
They will not shut up.
Yeah. And I'm with Glenn on any biting dog, like a chow or something like that. There's just. Yeah. Anyway, that's another episode. We'll get into that. Well, Glenn, what we want to talk about today is what's driving some of this genetic yield gain. And before we get started, just had one question kind of for you specifically, but what's some of the biggest shifts that you've seen in hybrid performance over the last decade or over the latter part of your career? What do you think some of the biggest shifts we've seen?
Yeah. So, you think back, so I went through this revolution of not just genetic gain, but traits, right? And, when I got, after I got out of college in the mid 80s, early 90s, it became evident to me that the future was going to be about genetics, and really we thought it was all going to be about traits, right? And that traits were going to drive. And I guess to some extent that's true, right? Roundup Ready, certainly, corn borer resistance, those traits did make it easier to manage corn, made it easier to manage pests, and maybe it allowed us to realize genetic gain. But the folks in white coats that actually bred corn were improving products every year, right? Beyond just the value that traits had. And so whether it's spatial technology or whether it's traits, oftentimes I think we want to give credit to whatever is the hottest, newest thing. But in reality, the largest single component to yield is genetic gain, and genetic gain has come largely from like marker assisted breeding, the technology that allows them to manipulate that 10 chromosomes that corn has, for example, and identify those sequences that really allow for higher yields, right? And and if you map it over time, right? I did this last year in our meetings, right? When we talked about we talked about genetic gain in those meetings, and basically I showed a table of the inbred era, single cross era, double cross era. Actually, it was double cross era and then single crossed era. And what you noticed is that slope of genetic gain went from being linear early on to being an exponential curve, and that curve is still going up at an increasing angle, right? So it's not like we're about to top out and this thing's going to flatten any day. That's not what the data would suggest, right? The data would suggest that this technology like marker-assisted breeding, which doesn't mean that it's transgenic, right? It doesn't mean that it's genetically modified. It just means that instead of somebody taking the time to select an inbred line, run it through the parent material program and breed it to itself 7 generations to get the thing cleaned up, and then start crossing it with sires in the stable, for example, to try to make a better hybrid. Man, that process has been shrunk down. Instead of 7 years to clean one up, they can use the double haploid program, dihaploid or double haploid, depending on which brand is doing it, and clean that thing up in a generation and a half, two generations basically, right? I say generation and a half because you can take it to the Southern Hemisphere and get the thing done in a relatively short period of time. So just what has made the biggest difference in our production is without question genetic gain, and what's been the driver of genetic gain are these technologies that have allowed us to exploit corn and breed it faster.
Yeah.
And so that's really the driver, and that's in my career and probably for some time to come, right? Regardless of what we do around nutrition, what we do around soil health, every new technology, every new horizon, this is going to revolutionize agriculture, right? This is going to revolutionize yields. Now, I'm not saying they haven't contributed, but there's nothing has had the impact that marker-assisted breeding and genetic gain has done.
I looked through an article yesterday, and what caught my attention was they were putting out their yield program, their high yield awards on corn, and it was for Southwest Indiana. And I recognized one of the names on one of the winners. Sure. I think he was second or third. Every one of those was over 300 bushel.
Right.
I think the high was like 322. And but I can also remember specifically talking to that one guy, and him talking about how, the weather is terrible, yields are going to be terrible. Yeah. And then I think his was 302, 305.
Sure.
Wow. And it still amazes me that what these plant breeders have been able to put together, and even when we have not ideal weather,
sure,
these things they yield.
Yeah.
And I guess I want to flesh out a little bit what you said there. It seemed like in the old days, back when I was even halfway associated with seed back in the 90s, it would take several years, and now it's like they can speed that up so much faster, and is part of it because they can use some of the traits to get to handle some of the problems and allow them to focus on that high end yield.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not convinced that they, if you've ever gone through the process of forecasting and so I was a seeds agronomist for lots of years, and sometimes so if you get behind, right, then it's always about yield, right? And yield is kind of this unwritten code. That's the first thing we want in a new hybrid is more yield. But what's second most important? What's third most important? Well, oftentimes it may be different. If Jeff, you own a seed company and you do business in 9500 day in Minnesota, and you go all the way to Tennessee where they raise 118, 119 day, corn, you may have a completely different list of needs for Minnesota than you do for Tennessee. Right. So, in a particular maturity zone, you may have a strength or a weakness, and that's what you focus on. Right. You focus on what your needs are for a particular maturity, because in large part, there's still within you think about Southern hybrids, they are exposed to more disease, but they also are inherently more disease resistant. Right. And so, maybe you have something that's really high yielding, but it's a little bit weak in its knees. Maybe then the focus is on stature, right? You think about our, currently, I don't care what brand you look at, right? There's a lot of parity across the brands. That's what the answer plot would suggest.
Yeah.
But, and I think there's reason for optimism there, right? Because it's a lot more interesting. Jeff, you're a NASCAR fan, right? If they all finish on the same lap, that's a lot more interesting than if one guy is just way out.
5 laps ahead. And everybody's like, okay, he's going to win. We'll just shut the TV off.
But not just is it more interesting, right? It's when you think about the value proposition, it makes it the more competitive it is, then the sharper the manufacturer's pencil has to be, right? It's actually better for a grower. He has more choice whenever there's more parity, and there's opportunity to maybe go. We all know what the racehorse is for any given, for any given year, any given neighborhood.
That's the highlight film right there.
Yeah, that's the highlight film, right? Well, that's like I was thinking about this just this morning on the way over here. I was thinking about how we, for generations now, it's not just for a couple decades, we've compared corns to horses, right? Well, this is a racehorse, right? Or this is this and the other. Occasionally you do have a 3394, a Secretariat, right? Think about Secretariat. That was a horse. I don't know anything about horse racing, but I went through the museum, down at Churchill Downs, and there was an exhibit about Secretariat and how it had a, 1.8x, sized heart. It had, when you went through all the metrics on this horse, it was without question had an incredible genetic advantage on the rest of the field. However, I can assure you, if you put me on that horse as a jockey, we would have finished last in all 3 races, right? And so I think it's maybe a better analogy than we thought, right? We've got a whole track full of horses, and the farmers represent the jockeys, and they probably don't have as much influence on yield as they think, right? Still, the largest influence is the right seed. But then once you got the right seed, it's about getting off to an early start, right? You can't come out of the gate and have the thing rear up and lose, 60 yards on the field and then always come from a catch-up position, right? That would be the guy that doesn't use starter or doesn't practice early season weed control. You think about that? Yeah. And so farmers are really kind of like the jockeys, but without question, the horsepower is the seed, and it's the genetic.
And maybe you're going to cover this, but I also have heard over the years, that guy he finds that right hybrid. It fits this field perfect. I've got the best shields. I'm going to plant this thing for the next 5 years. Well, then 2 years later, that hybrid's gone, and he's mad.
Yes.
And because now he's got to go find another racehorse for that field.
Sure.
So how do they decide that, hey, that's been a great hybrid for us, but now they're moving on?
Yeah, and so, man, there's a dozen ways I could bite this off, Jeff. Typically, because the primary factor they breed for is yield, there's almost always something coming that's newer. And in fact, most of the time when people get mad about losing a hybrid, it's not they're not mad about losing the hybrid that performs on the flat, sandy, dry track. What they get aggravated because they lost the mudder, right? They lost the one that'll handle wet anaerobic conditions, the one that goes up and down hills, the one that can stand there until November without getting weak ankles and falling down on the ground. Man, we got analogies on top of analogies. I've seen growers and maybe even myself as a grower probably get more shook up about losing the mules, right? There's always going to be another racehorse. But what's amazing, you can tell this from the answer plot data where you've got 250 to 350 bushel yields, right? There are plenty of products that can show up at the top. it's when the corn gets down, right? When corn falls over and then you're like, well, that's like being in the mountains. I don't want a thoroughbred up in the mountains. In fact, I might not even want a mountain pony. I might want a mule, right? I don't want any chance. If you're going to leave corn stand till November, I might want a mule. Now, I don't want it to be 40 or 50 bushels off the pace. So I want a race mule, Sal. but I still want something that's got good legs under it.
Yeah.
Right? Sure-footed.
Well, you mentioned the answer plot system. I think that's one of the things that we have access to the testing, and Winfield United published last year at 25. They published their insights guide, and that's kind of the primer. And one of the things that they showed was they showed with the Cropland brand,
Yep,
8.5 bushel advantage from the newer hybrids compared to I think just some that were just a few years old of some of their best hybrids from then, and 8.5 bushel. And that kind of goes back to what you said about the genetic gain.
Yeah. And by the way, when they say that there's it's gone from 1.5 bushel genetic gain to, 3.6 or that does ebb and flow a little bit. So there'll be freshman classes, right? So it was an 8 bushel genetic gain that year over the previous years, but you may have had 2 or 3 years in there where the genetic gain was only 2 bushel, right?
Yeah.
And so, and it has to do back with Jeff's question. I hate to keep going back to Jeff's question, but he's like, well, how do you decide what are you going to focus on? It depends on the maturity, right? Right now, for example, if we're talking about Bayer genetics as a whole, right? So we're talking about DeKalb brand, we're talking about our, the majority of our cropland varieties are probably Bayer centric, but we do have Corteva genetics and we do have Syngenta genetics in the cropland brand. But you can see the influence when you find something that really hits, right? I called 3394. That was a Pioneer hybrid from the 90s, right? That people still recognize the number today because it was like a secretariat. Mm-hmm. But today there's, we've got a product in the Bayer lineup, 6835 in this part of the world is one of those, it's maybe not a secretariat, but it's really, really a good corn, right? 118 day. Actually, it's a little drier than that. Maybe 117, 116 day is what it dries like. But does that mean that you want to plant all that? No. And the opportunity for growers, right? The thing that makes me optimistic is that, by the way, almost everything in that full season right now that is Bayer genetics is absolutely kick butt, right? Whether we're talking about the DeKalb brand, everything from 114 day on is just stellar. Or we're talking about the Cropland brand, right? I had 5911 last year. 5911 actually out yielded 6835 on my farm. I didn't think, nothing was down, but it was about 12 inches taller, maybe even 16 inches taller to the ear placement than what was the DeKalb. And so, does that mean I want to plant all of one or the other? No, but it sure makes a great companion. We had 5893. You see there's been no hype. You don't hear anybody talking about 5893. 5893 was ahead of 6835, right? And it was a little taller yet. And so, I certainly wouldn't want to use all 5893, but it certainly had lots of top end yield potential. 5682, another big, tall, full season hybrid, right? What you see is a trend, right? Once you find one of those sires, for example, that has the right genetic potential, right, has the right stuff, you will cross that to every dame in the stable, trying to,
come up with some,
trying to find a hybrid that's much better. And so right now, when it comes to full season genetics, that's where I probably want to be, right?
So what would be so farmers right now they're starting to plan, okay. Yep. So what you're telling me is hybrid selection is one of the most important things you're going to do.
Absolutely.
What's the top 3 things you need to be thinking about when you're sitting down to select hybrids? Because we've got all this answer plot data. All the other field
how do you sort that out?
Yeah. Well, that's where you got to have somebody that holds that data, right? You can't just look at the product guide, right? I thought about bringing one in, but you all seen product guides, and it's like, well, gee, if it's really just about 2 hybrids from each brand, then why do we need a product guide that's a half inch thick, right? It's because they're across geography, I want to qualify this. Across geography, there's one thing that I would suggest predicts how good a hybrid is, and it's this. A product that works across the widest geography are the best products, without question. But within an individual geography, you might have 3 or 4 products that fit, but one handles anaerobic conditions, right? Some of the products that are the highest yielding, some of my favorite products, when I put them down close to the power plant, I got some ground that really lays wet. It's a zip. It's like a Vincennes. It's a very poorly drained, slow permeability. Not every corn handles that. And by the way, I had some Corteva genetics down there that literally those water puddles, those little low spots that tend to pond, the corn literally grew right up to where there was standing water, and then there was no corn, and then there was corn again, right? In that particular. And so in that environment, really, Corteva's genetics were much better than the Bayer genetics or the Syngenta genetics, right? And I actually had several different products down there. I had 8 different products on that field trying to figure out what in the world was going to work. And yet that is oversimplifying, right? To say that, Corteva genetics then handle wet feet better. Nope, that's not really true. In that maturity, in that product line, it handled it better. Where do you find that information? Well, the answer plot is a great place because they've got plots that are on, wet environments, dry environments. And then there's local plots, right? I think sometimes we play down the value of local plots, and yet you will never see an answer plot in a swamp, right? And yet you can gain experience with
everybody's got that one field.
Yeah, everybody's got that one field. And it may be because it's got 28 wasp cobs and it's got, 12-degree slope. That might be the peril. It might be because it has, ponded areas. Everybody has a different peril, but the beauty of having so many products and having so many brands that are competitive at the top right now is that affords you to be able to go off on some of these other corns that maybe have some defensive quality that makes it a way better choice than just going for offensive. Right?
Well, one of the things that, not only just yield, but in that insights guide, it talked about how a hybrid will respond to fungicides. And how do they test those, and what does that tell us, and how should we use that in our decision making?
Yeah, and so that is a little bit misunderstood, right? A lot of times you think that in fact, there are companies out there that don't have testing programs for response to fungicide that just take and look at basically plant health, right? There's different ways you can quantify what is a good response to fungicide. If Jeff is a seed company says, hey, we've got this particular hybrid, it has tons of top end yield potential, but it's a little weak on disease, they might put a high response to fungicide on that product. When in reality, that means it's poor on disease. That it doesn't respond to fungicide, it is poor on disease. What we tend to consider a response to fungicide is, well, first of all, we say if it's something that is poor on disease, then it probably should always have a fungicide. That doesn't mean that it's responding to fungicide. That means that it's just poor on disease, right? I want to qualify that first. But there are products that plant growth regulator effect, right? That strobilurin effect that you get from carboxamides, SDHIs, strobilurins, those which are QOIs, right? Those chemistries tend to make some hybrids perform better because they alleviate stress, right? Whether that is the ability to metabolize better, whether it is around transpiration and reduced transpiration or increased transpiration, right? There's, whether you're Syngenta, whether you're BASF, or whether you're Bayer, right? They all have different. But it's well documented that when you put strobilurin fungicides on products, they oftentimes perform better even when there is an absence of disease. Well, you consider the answer plot is nationwide. There's a big part of the country, right? So in our part of the world, you realize that when the answer plot data suggests that there's a 10 bushel advantage to using a fungicide, that is ridiculous in our part of the world. We get a much bigger response than what they get nationally, right? Because the data points from North Dakota and South Dakota and Western Iowa and Eastern Nebraska and Eastern Kansas, right, where they have little or no disease, all get compiled in with the places like Southern Indiana.
Skews that data down.
It skews, it actually, I want to say it mitigates. That's not the right word. It mutes the data to actually make it look like there's less value to fungicides than what there really is. And so when you see data from Winfield, for example, or hopefully your premier ag representative that comes out, account rep, and he's talking about a response to fungicide, he's not saying that, this thing has poor health and we want to put a fungicide on this so it doesn't fall out of bed. He's saying that, hey, even in the absence of disease, when we use a fungicide on product X, it tends to yield better. And oh, by the way, if we have a heavy disease year, if we have documented tar spot, we have documented, southern rust, then absolutely we want to treat them all anyway. But it tells you where to spend that first dollar, right? That's the beauty, right? It's like putting the right jockey on the right horse, right? So,
they also looked at timing. So it wasn't just product specific. It was more what they found in that insights guide, and you've been talking about this for a long time, was just that how critical the timing was on corn.
Absolutely.
And can you go over with us a little bit about why, I guess when for the timing, and then why?
Yeah. So the timing might be different for different corns, right? If the most of the response is coming from the strobilurine effect, think about the years, Sal, leading up to 2025, right? From 2020 on up to about 2024, we went into June with less than optimal rainfall. And so the response you would get from an early fungicide application would be all around that reducing respiration, increasing the, photosynthetic assimilation. Right? It would be around those physiological effects, not around disease control, right? And so the timing there would have been early, and it would have been around stress mitigation. You take a year like this where we were just, saturated through most of the early growing season, right? All through grain growth, we were getting regular rainfall. Yeah. Well, then it might have been more around disease mitigation, right? As opposed to stress mitigation. So, yeah, I think that's almost impossible to answer because there's so many variables. But I can tell you this, right? The data would suggest, right, that I don't care, whether we're talking about tar spot or we're talking about southern rust or we're talking about the absence. There are some key timings, and one of those timings is that V10 front time frame. Now, I'm not saying it has to be at V10. It could be at V8. It could be at V12. We won't get much later than that because we're getting close enough to reproduction that we could, maybe cause,
miss the window a little bit.
Yeah, or we could potentially damage the corn, right? And that's highly unlikely. And we try to mitigate that by using things like master lock so that we don't have the precursors for arrested ear syndrome. But there's a key timing there in that V10, right? Which is when you are headlong, right? You are fully into grand growth, and that plant is putting on a new leaf every 2.5 to 3 days, right? If you can get that plant cleaned up at that time, within 3 weeks, about the time that product wanes, you're going to be at what? You're going to be at flowering, right? And every, every jockey out there knows that, boy, R1 is a great time to put on a fungicide. That's when you have silks. It's not VT, it's R1, right? That's when the silks first start exerting. And I'm not saying that's a terrible timing, right? That's a great time to start smacking the horse on the rump. But maybe it's a little better to lay back a couple of stages and go to 2.5, go to R3 when that plant is really starting to accumulate more sugar, starting to become a better host. And oh, by the way, it was already cleaned up from that V10 application. And so, maybe the better choice is to lay off just a little bit and then make that R2, R3 application that has the potential then with a 3 to 4 week residual to get you
to the finish line.
Yeah, get you all the way to the finish line.
We got to keep using the racehorse analogy.
Yeah, I love this racehorse analogy, right? We like to think that we're the drivers, but we're hanging on for dear life and we're trying to smack it at opportune times, right? And the other beauty is, right, when it comes to timing, Sal, if we're talking about fungicides, it's a great time to put in nutritionals, right? If we're going to see a response to zinc, manganese, boron, guess what? That's probably the perfect timing. If you go any later, right, you're probably too late for zinc. You go any earlier, you're probably too early on boron. And any time during grain growth is good for manganese, right? But one of our favorite nutritionals, and this isn't just mine. This is, you look at nationwide, probably one of the single most popular nutritionals on the market was Maxin ZMB, right? And there's an updated version that has, a little more boron in it that we're probably going to transition to called Maxin ZMB, Maxin Ultra ZMB Plus, right? And that product is even a little better fit. But how do you get that to respond? How do you make plants respond to that? Put it on at the right time. Right? Is the right time V4 when it's still just transitioning off the seed, or is it when you get into grand growth and it's putting on new vegetative material? In other words, the dry matter accumulation is exponential. It's just almost vertical, right? That's the time we see the big response.
So sounds like a farmer needs to partner up with like one of our account managers.
Absolutely.
And ask a lot of questions because you're doing trainings all the time with our account managers, and they live in this world all the time. That farmer's going to hear a lot of things and see a lot of things. But I think if he can have that trusted partner where he can ask questions and they live in that world every day, and they can help walk him through this decision making process.
Absolutely, our account reps. I want to break my fingernails on my shirt. Polish them up and tell you that I think our account reps are superior to most of the industry's account reps, right? And that's partially because we train, but it's not just about training. You realize that in agriculture, it is really common to train on what just happened, right? We all have fairly short memories, and we're pretty good about training on, this is what happened this year, or this is what happened last month. This is why the corn looks the way it is, or this is why, in reality, the real trick, right? And of course, you oftentimes you have lots of gray hairs before you figure this out. The real trick is to train just ahead of when you need that information. And so even our most experienced reps, even myself, right? Oftentimes just prior to a particular season, I will go back and refresh myself on what are the perils at this stage and what is it we're most likely to run into, right? So that I can then train, even some of our veterans, right? I'm thinking, I won't use full names, but like I think about Jeff. Jeff is a veteran. There's not many things that I'm going to teach to Jeff that he doesn't already know, but I certainly could refresh Jeff, right? And remind him as we get closer to that date, So our account reps not only, has leadership in Premier, done a great job of picking the right people. I feel like we do a really good job. If I tell Sal that we need, training on something, it's like, make it so, right? It's there's never any question.
Well, they're all passionate about it too. So that helps.
Yeah. So,
well, if you had to give growers some actionable tips or things so give them advice about what to do with this information, and knowing some of the things that you said about the newer hybrids and the genetic gain and the fungicide application timing, and then going into 2026, what's some of the things that they should plan and do? I mean, I know right now, we're hearing that some of these hybrids are short, right? I mean, everybody forecasting has got to be so difficult.
Yes.
I'm not going to try to defend Bayer or any of the manufacturers, but it's got to be a tough job.
Sure.
And, they got a new product and it's really good and it's very popular, and there's only so much of it.
Yeah. And what's funny is it's not really that new a product. It's been around a couple of years now, right? They're this lead product that is going to probably be in incredibly short supply. I'm glad you qualified that, because I was, you left that so open-ended when you first started.
Yeah.
Like, how will we possibly bite this off? And then you went into, how we use this information whenever it's likely we're not going to get the products that we ordered, right? And I'm not saying that we won't get the products we ordered. We may be limited on some of our most popular varieties. Well, remember, that product guide is full of other corns, right? And it may not be our favorite, but it's more like a racehorse than it is than an automobile race, right? Very few crashes on a racehorse, not, on a horse track. And you think about how they come across the line. You might have one that's a clear winner, or, one or two that are clear, but then there's this big wad, there's this big pack. And, being successful as a grower isn't always about predicting the one that wins the race. It's oftentimes about picking horses that are steady and consistent, right? Because what you saw from the answer plot data is that there's not a corn out there that has a 25 bushel advantage. It's 1.5, 2 bushel.
A lot of parity.
Yeah, there's a lot of parity. And oh, by the way, in that field, there are some horses that really handle the mud well, or really can handle maybe a heavier jockey, right? Or I'm not sure what exploded right there.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of great products out there where it's very likely that we will, not get all of our favorite corns. And that's almost every year. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's almost every year. So,
and then I guess the placement, just like what you said, that makes the placement that much more critical on the take this opportunity.
Absolutely.
To be more selective about some of the specific areas.
What we want to use as examples, and maybe using horses on a racetrack is a poor example, but let me give you just a personal example. The difference between a really good year for Glenn Longabaugh in his farming career versus his agronomic career, right? When I have a good year, it's not often because the ground, the Evansville silt loam that I have, that 40 acres of Evansville silt loam made 285 bushel. When I have really good years, it's when the reclaimed coal mine ground and the rough hill ground over here and the ground that maybe is ponded or has poor drainage, it's when those fields all kick in. And so that really speaks to having some diversity out there and recognizing where to place it. Where do you get that information? Well, that's where the answer plot comes in, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of information on there about, how does it do in sand, right? Because we have plots that are on sand. How does it do in heavier ground where maybe you have poor permeability? How does it respond to fungicides? How does it respond to population? How does it respond to nitrogen? You're thinking, well, how would I use that nitrogen data? Well, again, it's about timing, right? If it's something that is a nitrogen hog, then don't you think maybe it's probably going to respond to starter fertilizer, right? So if you're a guy that utilizes starter fertilizer, man, the difference, maybe not so much in furrow, but in that 2x2, if you're a guy that puts on nitrogen 2x2, then you could much more easily manage a high response to nitrogen corn than somebody who doesn't have 2x2. If you're somebody that side dresses nitrogen, right, then it's much easier for you to manage that product that responds to nitrogen than it is somebody that doesn't side dress, right? If you're somebody that goes out and you make one shot and you're trying to get by with 0.9 pounds, then you probably need to pick hybrids that have a low response to nitrogen, right? I mean, and sometimes, there's some gray whiskered hybrids out there too. And that's not the future, right? But some of those products stick around for a long time.
There's a reason why they're still around.
For a reason, right? I think about 8370 within the cropland line, right? 8370 is still a pretty high volume product. And that thing is older than Methuselah. And is it going to keep up with the products that are 6 years newer, 5-6 years newer, like a 5550, probably not, but it's not going to be that far off. It might be on this really rough ground where where you typically get it maybe planted later and you're going to leave it stand well into October. Man, that product stays green. It's within a couple bushels of top end yield potential. It's consistent up and down the hills, even in the draws, where the water tends to pond, the thing still has a stand. Is it going to keep up with something that's 10 years or 8 years newer, like a 5682 or a 5911, which is even out of its maturity zone? Probably not. But, every field that we farm is not it's not a racehorse field, right? It's not a cream puff piece of ground. It's not all contest ground, right? We have a lot of acres that, need steady performers. No, by the way, oftentimes those steady performing products, that, that are maybe priced a little bit off of that lead, that lead tier, right? But just know, I say that, and I have to qualify that, right? Your greatest potential to make money is not by saving money, right? It's by managing more intensely, and typically it's by making more bushels. And typically you make more bushels by adapting, right? Think if we have a 2 bushel, and it's higher than that, but if we had a 2 bushel genetic gain, and you're talking about a hybrid that's 8 to 10 years older, that thing's 20 bushels behind out of the gate, right? From the potential that's in the bag. And by the way, if there's 2 bushel of genetic gain in an average environment, it's probably, if you put that on a really good piece of dirt, right? An Evansville silt loam, a Ragsdale, right? From your neighborhood, right? You put that on a Ragsdale, it's probably going to be 40 or 50 bushels behind. But you put it on a Hosmer, right? Which is like an Alford with a Fragipan, or you put it on a Bloomfield or an Alvin, high sand, it might only be 5 bushels difference, right? Do you see?
Yeah.
So genetic gain is really important, but where you're going to see it is probably in your higher yield environments. That's where you're going to exaggerate genetic gain, right? So that's why we have so many products. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think our growers have a lot of homework to do when they sit down for hybrid selection. So
absolutely. And the beauty is, if they don't get everything they want, man, there is a huge depth of field, right? I heard, Larry the other day on a call said, "Oh my gosh, I'm afraid, 5911, we all talk about the DeKalb racehorse or the lead DeKalb product, but man, the lead cropland products, full season products are just kicking butt also, right? And of course, once they start performing, then there's more demand, and next thing you know, it's like, what are we going to do, right? We're not going to have enough of this. It's like, oh my gosh, you've seen 5682, it's right there with it. And oh, by the way, it's a little bit drier, and we got 5893, and there's, you move back a little bit. There's 5760. There's 5550. I mean, there's a whole plethora of corns that still perform incredibly well. Does that mean they're going to keep up on your best ground with 5911 or 6835? Probably not. But they're not that far off the pace, and on common ground, they might actually even be a better fit. So,
all right. Well, fertilizer guy, is that enough seed talk for you?
Yeah, he lost me a long time ago.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Well, that is amazing that just in our careers around this table, and you talk about the 90s, and I mean, we were looking for 145 bushels or 150 bushels, right? And then the 200 was the mark, and then almost immediately.
So some of those yields we had back then would be considered a crop failure today.
Crop failure. You couldn't. The economics wouldn't work, right? And but no, if you had 160 bushel yield, that's good corn. Had flex ears and planting around 24,000 population, and those things have changed.
Yeah, do you realize it's 1993 now? Is 30 years ago?
That is crazy.
More than 30 years ago, and that was the first year that I saw any scale of 200 bushel corn. And I remember coming home and telling my cousin, right? Because I worked at a retail facility, and I came home and told my cousin, and he bulled up and actually got mad and cursed at me. It's like, I don't want to hear any more BS about 200 plus bushel corn, right? Because he just thought that was some exaggeration, right? And of course, they hadn't started harvesting yet. And once they got to harvesting that year, they had some that was, that was in excess of 200 bushel. But yeah, it's, time passes pretty quickly.
Gosh.
And fortunately, the folks in white coats are keeping us ahead of the curve, right? It's our job to do things, right? We talked about timing, and we kind of passed it over because we talked about fungicides. But man, there's so many things, right? Whether it's starter, getting crops off to a good start and putting the right things in your starter, whether it's making sure we clean crops up, right? If we're going to make weed control passes, let's clean it up before we know from Dr. Swanton's data that it's not just about cleaning it up, prior to V6, right? The switch point is V4, which means we need to have not just make our application before V4, we need to have the crop cleaned up and the weeds be necrotic before V4, probably by V3. And so, timeliness is really, really important, right? Those best jockeys are pretty timely. Yep. So.
Well, we have beat that horse to death.
We have. Touche. Oh, that's excellent.
So anything else, Jeff, we need to cover on this?
No, I think we'd be shoving hay in a dead horse.
That's right. Well, Glenn, thanks a lot. We really appreciate your insight.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And coming over today and spending time with us. So that's another episode of The High Ground, powered by Premier Companies. Thank you all very much.